My name is Grace Bennett. I'm 32 years old. I work as a financial analyst in Dallas, Texas, and 6 weeks ago I woke up from spinal fusion surgery, a genuinely serious 8-hour operation, to an empty recovery room except for one person. Not my mother. Not my father. A man in a gray suit I hadn't seen in over a year, sitting quietly in the corner chair with a leather folder on his lap, waiting for me to open my eyes. My parents had chosen that same morning to attend my younger sister's baby shower, 2 states away instead. What that lawyer was actually waiting to tell me had nothing to do with sympathy, and everything to do with a decision my grandfather made 2 years before he died. One my parents never knew existed until that exact morning. Before I get into it, if you've ever needed someone to simply show up for you and watch them choose something easier, instead, this story is for you. Subscribe if that resonates and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, because I genuinely read every single one. I should tell you about my grandfather first, because nothing in this story makes sense without him. My grandfather, Walter Bennett, built a regional logistics and freight company from a single truck in 1974 into a business worth close to $40 million by the time he retired. He was the kind of man who believed fiercely that character revealed itself in exactly 2 situations: hospitals and funerals. The moments when showing up costs you something: real comfort, convenience, an easier plan you'd already made. He used to say it at every family dinner growing up so often it became almost a family joke. You find out who somebody is when they're inconvenienced by you. I don't think any of us, myself included, fully understood how literally he meant that sentence until 6 weeks ago. My family situation is fairly simple to explain on the surface. I'm the older of 2 daughters. My sister Kayla is 28, married 2 years ago, and announced her first pregnancy 8 months before my surgery, to genuine excitement from the entire family, myself included. My parents, Linda and Frank, had always been warmer toward Kayla in the specific hard-to-name way some parents are warmer toward the child who needs less explaining, whose milestones fit neatly into the story they wanted to tell about our family. I'd learned over the years not to compete for that particular warmth, focusing instead on building a career I was proud of. 3 hours from home, close enough to visit, far enough to breathe. Grandfather Walter passed 2 years ago, and in the 2 years before that, during his final stretch of declining health. I was the one who drove up almost every weekend, sat with him through chemotherapy appointments, brought him the specific brand of butterscotch candy he liked, listened to the same stories about the freight business more times than I could count. My parents visited occasionally Kayla, less often, both citing busy schedules, both assuming I think that someone else would handle the harder parts, and someone else always did. Me. I want to tell you about the surgery itself, because the timing matters enormously. 8 months ago, I herniated 2 discs in a car accident that wasn't my fault, and after months of physical therapy that didn't resolve the pain, my surgeon scheduled a spinal fusion, a genuinely major procedure, 8 hours under anesthesia, a mandatory 3-day hospital stay, followed by weeks of limited mobility. I told my family the surgery date the moment I had it, 6 weeks in advance, giving everyone ample time to plan around it. 2 weeks before my surgery, Kayla's baby shower got scheduled, apparently without much thought, given to my own date for the exact same Saturday. When I mentioned the conflict to my mother, gently expecting an easy resolution, she said, "Oh, honey, we already told everyone the shower date. Surely you understand it's not like we can move a baby shower. You'll have plenty of people at the hospital anyway, won't you?" I want you to notice something in that sentence, because I noticed it too the moment she said it. Not, "We'll figure out how to be there for both." Not even, "I'm so sorry, we'll come to the hospital after." Just an assumption stated plainly that my major surgery was the more flexible event of the 2. I didn't push back because pushing back had rarely worked in my family, and because some part of me still hoped that when the actual morning arrived, they'd change their minds. If you're already feeling your stomach turn a little at that, hope, stay with me, because it gets more complicated before it gets resolved. And if this is hitting close to home for you, drop a comment and let me know, because I genuinely read every single one. The morning of my surgery, I checked into the hospital at 6 a.m., alone, my best friend Priya meeting me an hour later, when she'd dropped her kids at school, staying with me through the pre-op process, holding my hand until they wheeled me back. I texted my mother from the pre-op room a simple, hopeful message, heading into surgery in about 20 minutes. Love you. Her reply came back 40 minutes later after I was already under anesthesia, though I wouldn't read it until much later. Have a great surgery, sweetie. We're at the shower. Everyone says hi. Kayla looks beautiful. We'll call you tonight. We're at the shower. Not we're on our way. Not we couldn't make it, but we're thinking of you every minute. Just a cheerful confirmation that the shower had in fact won. I want to pause the story here and ask you something because I've thought about it constantly since. If you texted your parents the morning of major surgery and got back a message telling you cheerfully exactly where they'd chosen to be instead, what would you have felt in that moment? Tell me in the comments, because I've never quite found the right word for what I felt reading that message hours later. I woke up from surgery just after 3 p.m. Groggy, my throat raw from the breathing tube, my back aching in a deep, unfamiliar way. Priya had stepped out to grab coffee, planning to be back within 20 minutes, and in that narrow window, the only other person in my recovery room was a man in a gray suit sitting quietly in the corner chair, a leather folder resting on his lap. Grace, he said gently. Once he saw my eyes open, my name is Robert Klein. I was your grandfather's attorney, and I still am in a manner of speaking for a few specific matters he left in my care. I've been waiting for you to wake up. I remember even through the thick fog of anesthesia, feeling a small specific confusion settle into my chest. I hadn't seen Robert Klein since the reading of my grandfather's will over a year earlier, and I had no idea why he'd be sitting in my recovery room instead of my own parents. He explained slowly and carefully that my grandfather, in the final 2 years of his life, had grown increasingly concerned about a specific pattern he'd noticed forming inside our family, a pattern of who showed up when it was easy and who quietly disappeared when it wasn't. He'd watched me drive up nearly every weekend during his illness, watched my parents and Kayla appear far less consistently, and he'd decided, with Robert's help, to build something into his estate plan that most people never think to include. Not a punishment exactly, Robert was careful to clarify, but a test built specifically around the exact kind of moment I'd just lived through. I asked him, my voice still hoarse, what that actually meant. Robert opened his folder and explained the mechanism plainly. My grandfather had left his 40% controlling stake in the family logistics company in a specially structured trust to be divided equally between his 3 grandchildren, myself, Kayla, and our cousin Ethan upon each of our respective 35th birthdays, unless a specific clause was triggered earlier. That clause, drafted with unusual precision, stated that if any grandchild experienced a qualifying major medical event defined explicitly as a surgery requiring general anesthesia and an overnight hospital stay, and that grandchild's own parents failed to be physically present for any portion of the procedure day, without a documented, verifiable emergency of their own, that specific grandchild's share of the controlling stake would immediately vest in full rather than waiting until 35. I want to say that clause out loud again because I need you to understand exactly what my grandfather had built. He hadn't simply left me money. He had built a mechanism specifically designed to reward the exact behavior he valued most, showing up, and to correct financially and structurally the exact behavior he feared most in the people meant to raise me. If you're already feeling your stomach turn the way mine did, I understand completely. Stay with me, because it gets more complicated before it gets resolved. And I want to ask you something once we get there. I asked Robert how he'd even known to be there in my recovery room on that exact day. He explained that as part of the trust's structure, he was required to monitor and document qualifying medical events for all 3 grandchildren using notifications from each grandchild's own emergency contact information, which I had, without ever realizing its significance, listed him as a secondary contact on years earlier, back when my grandfather had first asked me to framing it simply as in case anything ever happens and your parents can't be reached. I had thought nothing of it at the time. I understood now, lying in that recovery bed, exactly what my grandfather had quietly built into a request that had seemed almost sentimental. Robert had arrived that morning specifically to observe in person whether my parents would be present. He'd waited in the hospital's main lobby through the entire 8-hour surgery, watching the waiting room, confirming formally and directly that no one matching my parents' description had checked in at any point. He'd also, he told me gently, already begun the documentation process required to formally trigger the clause, cross-referencing my mother's own social media post from that afternoon, a photo from Kayla's baby shower time-stamped precisely during my surgery, geotagged 300 miles away. I want to ask you something here because I've turned it over constantly since. Do you think my grandfather, watching our family for those final 2 years, genuinely believed this moment would come? Or do you think some part of him hoped until the very end that he was wrong about all of us? Tell me what you think in the comments because I still don't have a real answer. I didn't call my parents that day. I was still recovering, genuinely exhausted, and Robert gently suggested I take a few days before anyone else in the family found out what had actually happened, both for my own healing and because he wanted to finish the formal documentation properly before anyone had the chance to contest it. 4 days later, once I was steady enough for a longer conversation, my mother called cheerful, asking how the surgery had gone, mentioning the baby shower's centerpiece arrangements in the same breath as though both topics carried equal weight in that particular week. "Mom, I need to ask you something," I said. "Did you know Grandpa had something specific in his will about parents showing up for surgeries?" There was a long pause. "What are you talking about, Grace?" I explained it plainly, the clause Robert's documentation, the trust vesting immediately rather than waiting until I turned 35. The silence on the line stretched long enough that I said her name twice. "That can't be right," she finally said. "Your father and I are still your parents. We still get our share when everyone turns 35. This doesn't change anything for us directly." I asked her gently whether she understood that it did change something, not the money exactly, but what the money represented. My grandfather had built a mechanism specifically to notice formally and permanently the exact moment she'd chosen a baby shower over my surgery. "We didn't choose the shower over you," she said, her voice sharpening now. "We assumed you'd have people there. We didn't think one day would matter this much." I want you to sit with that phrase the way I had to lying in my recovery bed. We didn't think one day would matter this much. My grandfather, it turned out, had thought exactly that day would matter enough to build an entire legal mechanism around it precisely because he understood something about my parents that I'd spent years quietly absorbing without ever fully naming it. I asked my parents and Kayla to come to my apartment 2 weeks later once I was steady enough to have the full conversation in person. My mother, I could tell from her tone, still assumed this would end with some version of reassurance that the trust technicality wouldn't really change anything meaningful between us. Kayla arrived first, genuinely unaware of the trust's specific mechanism, her hand resting on her now visible pregnancy, asking how my recovery was going with real warmth. My parents arrived 15 minutes later, my mother carrying a container of soup. I laid Robert's documentation folder on my coffee table and slid the first page toward Kayla before anyone else could speak. "Before anyone says anything, I want you to see this." It was the trust clause itself, printed plainly, followed by Robert's formal documentation of that day, the hospital lobby sign-in logs, the time-stamped geotagged photo from the baby shower, the exact 8-hour window during which no one matching my parents' description had ever checked into the hospital. Kayla read it slowly, her face shifting from confusion to something much heavier. "Wait, Grandpa built this specifically to check whether Mom and Dad showed up for us?" "For any of us," I said. This time it happened to be about my surgery. My mother's composure cracked immediately. "This is exactly why your grandfather could be so difficult. Testing people, keeping score even from beyond the grave." I spoke next as evenly as I could manage. "He wasn't testing us, Mom. He was testing you. And you didn't just fail a test. You told me over text exactly where you'd chosen to be instead while I was still under anesthesia." My father, who rarely says much at these gatherings, finally spoke quietly. "We really didn't think it would matter this much, Grace. We thought you'd understand." Kayla turned to our parents, and I watched something shift in her face that I hadn't fully expected. You skipped her spinal surgery for my baby shower, and neither of you thought to tell me that was even a conflict? I would have moved the date in a heartbeat if I'd known. I want to be honest that Kayla's reaction was the part of that afternoon I hadn't fully prepared myself for. I had braced myself for her to feel caught in the middle defensive of our parents by instinct. Instead, my sister looked genuinely horrified and genuinely angry on my behalf once she understood the actual timeline. My mother, cornered now by both of her daughters, at once tried one final redirect. So, what happens now legally? Does this cost us something specific? I told her plainly that the trust mechanism affected only the timing and structure of my own eventual ownership stake, not any direct loss to her or my father. But that's not really the point. Is it? I said. The point is that Grandpa built an entire legal safeguard specifically because he didn't trust you to show up without one, and you just proved him right. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after that. Kayla finally reached over and took my hand. I'm so sorry, Grace. I should have checked the date myself instead of just assuming everything would work out. That's on me, too. Here's where things stand. Now. The trust clause has been formally processed, my portion of my grandfather's company stake vesting 3 years earlier than originally scheduled, managed for now by Robert, until I turn 35 with full transparency into how it's invested. I've started attending quarterly board meetings for the freight company, something I never expected to do this early, and I've found unexpectedly that I genuinely love the work. The same steady, careful attention to detail that drew me to my career in finance in the first place. My relationship with my parents remains genuinely strained. My mother still frames the entire situation as my grandfather's rigidity rather than her own absence, which tells me she hasn't fully reckoned with the actual choice she made that morning. My father has been quieter, more reflective, and told me once plainly that he should have pushed harder to be there regardless of what my mother had already planned. Kayla and I are closer now than we've been in years, and she's made a point more than once of telling our parents that she won't let future family decisions get made around her without checking with me first. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. The people who love you the most will move their entire schedule for the moments that actually matter without needing to be asked twice. And sometimes the people who see that pattern most clearly aren't in the room with you at all. They're the ones who built something quiet years in advance specifically. So the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. If this story reminded you of a moment when someone chose the easier option instead of showing up for you, share this with someone who'd understand. Tell me in the comments, did you see the twist coming the moment Robert Klein walked into that recovery room, or did it genuinely surprise you the way it surprised me? And if you want more stories like this, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. I'll see you in the next one.